So we watched a video the other day from a very popular photography-based YouTube channel. I'm not going to mention any names, but it sounds like Boney Torthrop. The video is entitled 4K Failed, the truth about 4K versus HD. My issue with the video is that it spouted a lot of arguable misconceptions and misinformation, and to be honest, sounded more like a propaganda sales pitch for the EOS R. Not only that, it was rather ironic and laughably hypocritical. The summary of the video, in case you haven't seen it, is about 4 or 5 years ago that channel switched from shooting HD to 4K, and they've now made the decision that they're going to go back to shooting only in HD. Now, the whole argument of 4K versus HD is as old as time itself. Well, it's not. It's a couple of years old since 4K got introduced. But the fundamentals of it, it's personal preference, okay? There's no right or wrong answer as to which one you should be shooting in. And there are pros and cons to each. The problem is that the video in question only seemed to highlight the pros towards the HD, not the 4K. A couple of complaints about 4K, both made in that video and in general as well. Firstly is that 4K requires more storage space. Higher resolution, bigger file sizes, more room, more storage required. Firstly, the video files aren't always bigger. The file size of a video is not dictated by the resolution, it's dictated by the bitrate. If they had the same bitrate, they would have the same file size, even if you had a 4K at 60 megabits a second, and if you had a 1080p video at 120 megabits a second, it would be double the file of a 60 megabit 4K. But regardless, even if the video files were to be larger, the cost of storage these days has come down massively compared to when 4K was first introduced. I mean, like a couple of years ago, you'd struggle to find an SD card that was larger than 32 gig. Nowadays, you struggle to find SD cards that are smaller than 32 gig. When you consider RAW video, 6K, 8K, I mean, look at the 1DX Mark III. That's shooting 5.5K RAW. 5 minutes worth of that blows through 128 gigabytes. So the demand for bigger and bigger memory cards drives down the price of the smaller memory cards, which run these perfectly fine. And exactly the same with computer hard drives. Nowadays, you can get hard drives in the dozens of terabytes for the price of what used to be at dozens of gigabytes. And on the topic of computer components, there's the argument that the higher resolution and the bigger file sizes warrant faster processors and better GPUs to be able to render it all. But again, 4K resolution these days is no longer the cutting edge of where technology is. Sure, 5 years ago, only really high-end computer components could handle the 4K files and rendering a 4K picture. But nowadays, manufacturers are designing computer components that can handle 4K gaming, that are having to handle higher refresh rates of 144, 240, hell, even now 360 Hz, and they're having to deal with the RAW video, the 6K video, they're having to deal with programs like Blender that is creating these worlds from nothing. So compared to all of that, 4K is frankly a piece of piss. The other common argument against 4K is it really worth it, because are people actually watching your videos in 4K? Now, in the video in question, they do say that there are a lot of big YouTube channels out there that only shoot in 1080. They haven't bothered going up to 4K. Now, according to their analytics, only a couple of % of their viewers watch the content in 4K because the majority of them are watching them on smartphones, and smartphones aren't 4K devices. Now, I can't speculate as to the analytics for their main videos because I don't have that information. But I do know from the analytics of my own channel, 48.8% of all my videos viewed have been viewed on mobile phones, 35.5% has come from computers, about 8.5% on tablets, and about 6.5% on TVs. Now, while at least the majority that I know of phones and tablets don't have 4K displays, so you can't watch 4K videos, a massively growing number of computers and TVs are 4K. Now, obviously, not all of the 4K potential category is going to have 4K devices, and even if they do, might not be streaming it in 4K. But I do believe that that number is going to grow and grow and grow. I think some smartphones have started to hit Quad HD, which isn't quite true 4K, but it won't be long before we start seeing smartphones with 4K and higher. And I know you can argue the toss and say that on such a small screen, you're not going to see the difference. But firstly, if anyone uses it with a VR headset, then you do notice the difference. And secondly, people aren't going to give a toss. If Apple or Samsung release a smartphone with a 4K or a 5K resolution screen, people will buy it regardless. So that'll be more 4K capable displays hitting the market. Then as to the argument about the amount of data required to stream all of that, more and more people are switching on to the likes of faster fiber broadband these days. You've got 5G starting to roll out, which is ridiculously fast compared to 4, and more network providers these days are releasing plans with higher and higher data limits, some even unlimited. So even though you might not see much of a difference between 4K and 1080, it is not going to stop people from wanting the latest greatest tech and all of the best features possible. And on the whole topic of can you see the difference between 4K or not, it's very user dependent, I find. There's a lot of people I've seen say they cannot see the difference between 4K and 1080. But a lot of people, and sometimes I include myself in that, can see the difference between 4K and 1080. There's been times where I've been viewing stuff on a 4K display and I know it's not true 4K. It's like 1080 trying to upscale. So a lot of people might not be able to see the difference or care about the difference between 4K and HD, but there are a lot of people that do, and they will want to see the best possible quality. Might only be a fairly small percentage, but it's a percentage nonetheless. But even if you don't want to export and upload a 4K file, there are still advantages to shooting your original footage in 4K. You still keep a 1080 timeline, but you've got an original video that's 4 times the resolution, which means you can cut into your video acting like a digital zoom to try and replicate that you've got 2 cameras filming at the same time just from the one stream. But regardless of that, there is still a video quality difference between whether you film in 1080 for a 1080 video or you film in 4K for a 1080 video. So this video, you might have spotted, is exported in 1080p, but right now I am filming in 4K. Now I'm going to swap to 1080 and you can see the difference. So this is 1080 25p at 50 megabits a second, but you should be able to see that there is far less detail and sharpness within the overall scene. The reason for this is how the cameras are extracting that 1080p footage. So generally what most cameras will do for 1080 is line skip all of the irrelevant information. So it's going to skip 22 out of 24 of the megapixels. So it's going to cut away about 80 or 90% of all of that potential data. With 4K, however, at least on the Sony camera, it's actually reading a 6K oversample. So it takes the full 24 megapixels, which is a 6K readout, takes all of the information from the sensor and then compresses it into a 4K video file so you don't lose anywhere near as much information. But even if you're shooting with a 4K camera that doesn't oversample from a higher resolution and just shoots a native 4K, once you then compress that down into a 1080 timeline, you're oversampling it from 8 meg down to 2 meg. But it is worth reminding that it's not all about resolution. Okay, just having the sharpest video possible, it doesn't make your video better. Quality of the content within the video, the audio, the lighting, all have far bigger, more pressing roles than the resolution with which you are shooting. But the resolution is still a piece of the larger puzzle that can add higher production value to your video. In essence, the whole argument of 4K versus HD is exactly the same as resolution when it comes to stills. Having higher resolution stills doesn't make up for better composition and better lighting and better storytelling. You can have a monkey with a 100 megapixel medium format camera that takes crap looking pictures that are really high resolution, and you can have someone who is really clinical at being able to tell a story with a picture shot on a smartphone. And the smartphone pictures will look better than the medium format. Might not look as sharp, but the image will be more engaging. The content within the image is still far more important than the resolution, but if you had the handle on everything else, then the resolution just gives you that extra bump in production value, or it gives you that extra flexibility in being able to crop in. And while you have a camera that's capable of producing 20, 30, 40 plus megapixel stills, how are most people viewing those images? The majority of times that people view those images are either on a smartphone or a tablet or a computer screen, and that can see no more than 8 megapixels at best. But on occasions, for a small percentage of your overall views, people might want to see really big print and be able to see all that extra detail. It's exactly the same as 4K 1080 argument. It's personal preference, there's no right or wrong answer, it's whatever suits you best. But here is where the hypocrisy comes in, because he spends this entire video in question talking about how the files of 4K are too big, that they don't offer any benefit to the majority of people, that it requires all this extra storage, that it requires all this extra processing power. And take a guess what their daily driver cameras are.
The Sony a7R Mark IV. A good all-around camera that both you and I decided we would adopt as our main daily cameras.
That's right, the 60 megapixel Sony a7R IV. Because how often do you actually need that size of resolution? And then there's the pièce de résistance of the whole video for me, which is the irony of it all. Making it sound like the EOS R is the only full-frame camera that allows you to record yourself, which is bollocks. Yes, it is the only full-frame 4K camera with its own front-facing screen, so you're able to see yourself out and about on the go with no additional hardware. Although irony number one is that despite being able to see himself, he seems to have screwed up the composition and spends most of the video with his head chopped off. But there are plenty of other alternatives. There are lots of full-frame cameras that shoot 4K video that, while don't have a flip-round screen, have a HDMI port where you can stick a pretty cheap external monitor on battery power so you can see yourself, or all of them have Wi-Fi for the phone in your hand and get a live stream video so you can see exactly what you're doing, which is what I used to regularly do. Or you don't use full frame because realistically you do not need a depth of field that's 4mm deep for video. It's great for pictures trying to isolate just your eye, but for video it's a little bit off-putting. And this is where we get onto Irony, the sequel, where the 3-minute advertisement for the EOS R, how good the EOS R is, that it's the best camera for shooting yourself. The whole time he's walking back and forth to the camera, the video keeps going in and out of focus. There's no point having such a ridiculous shallow depth of field if you're not inside it. But anyway, rant over. I'm just going to leave it here. That's it for this video, guys. What did you make of the 4K versus HD claims? Leave your thoughts and comments in the box down below. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.